I'm Ross Ramsey, the executive editor of the Texas Tribune. I am joined today by Congresswoman Veronica Escobar and McAllen Mayor Jim Darling. Escobar is an El Paso Democrat. She's represented Texas's 16th congressional district since 2019. She sits on the House Judiciary, Armed Services, and Ethics Committees and is vice chair of the Democratic Women's Caucus. Escobar is also co-chair of the Women's Working Group on Immigration. Previously, she served as El Paso County Judge and as a county commissioner. Darling has been the mayor of McAllen since 2013. Previously, he spent 28 years as a city attorney with the city and other governmental entities, and as a city commissioner for 6 years. Darling is also the chair for the Lower Rio Grande River Authority, River Water Authority, the Hidalgo-McAllen International Bridge, and the Anzalduas International Bridge Board. Let's just jump right in. You know, we've all read a lot about the situation on the border. And if we could, Congresswoman, I'll start with you. What's your description of what's going on now and how it's the same or different from what we've seen before?
Ross, first, many thanks to you and to the Texas Tribune for having this conversation. I'm so glad to be having it with you and with Mayor Darling. Ross, in so many ways, we're seeing the same thing that we've seen for a number of years. And, every other year, it may be a different group or a different challenge. But since for almost a decade, we've seen mostly Central American, either individuals, families, or children arriving at our front door. And they are running from a situation that is untenable for them, and they are running to a country where the vast majority of them already have family living here and working here. We are also seeing communities along the border really being, in some respects, like first responders. Communities like El Paso, and I think also in South Texas, you have NGOs and incredibly generous, kind volunteers coming to the aid of many of these families and individuals. But I think the context of what's happened over the last decade and what hasn't happened is really, really important. We have now had 3 different presidents facing the same challenge at the border with regard to Central American migrants. For the first time, I believe we have an administration that wants to tackle this in a very holistic, forward-facing way. Day one, President Biden presented the Congress with an immigration bill, a broad, robust bill. So he's asking Congress to act. He's asked his Vice President Kamala Harris, to handle the root causes. And he has appointed and put in place some really remarkable leaders, both at the Department of Homeland Security and in other spaces. We have a lot of work to do. I think it's been frustrating for me and I think for others in my community to see some members of the media act as though this is a brand new phenomenon that happened on January 20th, the day that President Biden was inaugurated, when those of us here at the border know that this has been ongoing for a long time. And until we address this strategically with humanity and with compassion and with thought about our entire hemisphere, we will be having the same conversation every single year. So I'm committed to working with the administration to finally addressing this in a humane, thoughtful way.
Mayor Darling, what's it look like on your end of the Texas-Mexico border? How would you describe the current situation?
Well, first thing, good morning, and good morning, Congresswoman. It's great to see you again. I guess if you say in Zoom, by the way, great to see you. But this is our 3rd rodeo, and so it's pretty similar. We're a little more organized this time, we're seeing we got a call about a week ago, Saturday, they was going to tick up. And so we went from about 200 to 600 to 700 family members being released to us. So that's been a little bit of a challenge, but we could handle it. We're ready. We were ready for it when we first saw it, and we were partnering up with some other cities. And of course, our main partnership with Catholic Charities. So the little bit different this year is because of COVID, and we have to do the testing and the quarantine, which creates a new additional problem. And when one person has it, you don't quarantine just the one family member, it has to be the whole family member. So we've been a little taxed with that. but nothing that we can handle. And that's kind of what our message is. When you look at national news, the border's in chaos and it's a crisis. I got more questions about crisis. I would hate to say it's a semantic argument, but that's what it is. And certainly it was in Washington where they can't resolve this issue. And for Border Patrol, it's a crisis. But what we like to say is our city's still safe. We're either first or second behind El Paso, and we're handling it. And hopefully they'll resolve it pretty soon. Speaking to that, in 2014, we met with them. We have the 3 Central American consulates in our city, right across from City Hall, and the Mexican consulate. So we met with them and some of the ambassadors and came up with a Tri-Mexa plan. There was a plan to address the criminal justice system, economic system, healthcare, and educational systems in those 3 countries, with maybe Mexico providing some guidance because they have more proximity to those countries. Sent that to Washington and not really much action except sending money down and $1 billion here, you handle it, instead of really some comprehensive change in Central America to address the underlying issues of why people are coming here.
You said, you mentioned at the top of your remarks, Mayor, that this was your 3rd rodeo. How does this one compare to the first 2 rodeos?
Well, the first one was kind of a surprise. We weren't ready for it. You know, we had a trickle of people and all of a sudden we had 100 and then we had 200. And at the peak of it, we were having 800 or 900.
And that was so, when?
It was getting ready. When we first saw it, I realized right away that we need to have one point person, and because we had a lot of NGOs wanting to volunteer, and right away we knew it was going to be a sustainability issue. So we partnered up with Catholic Charities, and that has worked very well. We used a church a center. We said we were going to borrow it for a little bit, and that ended up with 3 years. so it was longer, right? The second one under President Trump was much shorter, but more intensive. We had people, 1,500, 1,800 people coming across. By the way, in 2014, the condition of the immigrant asylum seekers was much worse. You know, they were taking a beast, and it was in the summertime primarily. And if we didn't take care of the kids, they would have not made it to some of the cities they were going to. In 2019, it was much more aggressive with many more adults. We had Cubanos because Cubans lost their right of asylum, so we had them crashing our bridges. We had to narrow our bridges to 1 lane instead of 8 lanes, both north and south, because they were coming across the bridge, much like they did in California and San Diego in the 90s with Mexicans. This time it was with Cubans and Central Americans and even Chinese, a whole bunch of different people from all over the world were involved in that. And so Border Patrol, CBP at the bridges became much more. They became mini camps that they were processing people before they could leave. It was chaos at the bridges. It was really terrible. And but the people are coming across a little better. I guess the cartels figure we can't kill all our customers, right? So it was a little nicer than that. And it was a shorter duration because I think what happened, all these happened because of rhetorics of the presidents. You know, the first one was President Obama said, we're going to fix immigration in this country with DACA and all that. And the cartels use that to say, you better get there before it happens because otherwise you won't be eligible. And then under President Trump, he said, I'm going to shut the borders, but he didn't have his legal ducks in a row to be able to do that. So they said, you better get there because the border's going to be closed. And so we had the huge rush. And this time, President Obama said, President Biden says, well, whatever it is going to be good, kind of, you know, his reform package. And everybody said, well, you better get over there now, too, before that all acts. And so a little different each time. And then with COVID, this was even a little more different.
Congresswoman, you're in a unique position, having seen this as a local official, wondering what the feds were doing, and now looking at it as a federal official, wondering what the locals are doing. Could you talk about that a little bit? And I'm curious, kind of what your experience was, how you gauge this particular edition of this problem, and what do you think from both the local and the federal perspective is in the way of us getting this fixed?
Ross, so you're right. I mean, I remember as a local official feeling incredible frustration with Washington, and I wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times back in 2014 at at the beginning of the Central American influx of families and individuals. And it's called Why the Border Crisis is a Myth. And I tried to contextualize what was happening. The minute you call something a crisis, then you focus on where you think it is. And for some of my our Republican leaders at the time and Democrats, the idea was, let's fix the border, let's harden it, let's build walls, let's militarize. And I felt like at the time, I was very frustrated that they weren't looking at this in a broader way, the way that Mayor Darling was looking at it. Like, let's work together, let's come together, and let's address what's happening together. And I think President Obama did not adequately address the situation. I think President Trump made it far worse. I think, to something that Mayor Darling said about the words of presidents, I guess I look at it a little bit differently. I think regardless of who's in office and regardless of the words, the cartels will use anything, or the human traffickers will use anything as a lure. They'll even make things up, I've learned. And so it takes our eyes, like the media is focused for 3 weeks now on the messaging of the White House instead of, how do we best address this? In 2019, my first year in Congress, when we saw some really horrific human rights violations on the border in El Paso, the detention facilities were overcrowded in a way that was absolutely inhumane. People had the same clothes for weeks at a time. I was talking to migrants who hadn't showered in a month, who hadn't brushed their teeth in a month, who were eating frozen burritos. It was horrific. And in that first year for me in Congress, it was important to me to have my colleagues see what was happening so that we could begin to rethink the border. And so in 2019, I brought nearly 20% of Congress to El Paso. Literally every other weekend, my team and I had guests from Congress. We would, if they had extra time, we'd take them into Juarez so that they could actually meet the asylum seekers and refugees and have conversations with them to hear for themselves why people were fleeing. We would walk them through the whole process, going across, at the port of entry, go to the processing center, go to our NGOs where families were welcomed and offered hospitality, so that they could understand how a system that was designed for single adults is now completely outdated when it is families and children that are arriving at our door mostly, and how it takes Border Patrol's eyes off of, real threats when we treat all of those folks who arrive at our doorstep as national security threats. So I wanted them to rethink the way that they thought about the border. I wanted to try to influence the appropriations process, and I was able to. One of the things that I advocated for was civilianizing some personnel inside these facilities, was able to get some of that done, but it needs a complete overhaul. And of course, at the time, the Trump administration was deeply uninterested in addressing the root causes. So all we could do as federal representatives was do what we could through the appropriations process to try to adjust, because there just has been absolute gridlock on so many ways. Now, we have passed in Congress a couple weeks ago, we passed 2 pieces of legislation, the DREAM Act and the Farm Worker Modernization Act, which will deal with some of the members of our communities who are undocumented inside our country already. But it is the U.S. Citizenship Act, that Biden bill that he delivered to Congress, that's being carried by the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, that is broader and that will help us address this, not completely, but will really address much of what we're seeing. The problem will be, even if we get it passed in the House of Representatives, until we do away with the filibuster, the Senate has become an instrument of the status quo. And nothing's going to get through there unless it's tied to some must-pass appropriations bill or the National Defense Authorization Act or reconciliation. And that's not a way to govern. We had all 18 senators parachute into Texas and go to the border. Many of them, Lindsey Graham, John Cornyn, Ted Cruz, they've had an opportunity to create change and they've chosen not to. It's frustrating.
Mayor, what are the facilities like? Have you been able to see how the migrants who make it over the border are being housed temporarily or, detained or whatever you want to call it this time as compared to other times? Congresswoman talked about, the conditions in places like Tornillo last time. What's it look like now? And how does it look as these numbers swell?
Well, the first one was the Ursula Center, and that was in McAllen. And, they're overwhelmed with kids. And so they have to find sponsors. They have to find the adults. The 72 hours really not realistic for the numbers they're handling. And so we're getting involved that, well, you can't hold them more than 72 hours. You need to release them. Well, that's not possible to do that in a safe manner for the kids. So the first thing they need to do is extend that time. And I was surprised when, I don't want to be critical of anybody, but President Biden said, well, it's no surprise it happens every winter. It just didn't happen because of me. Well, that's not necessarily true. It didn't happen last winter. And so I just thought the administration should have been better prepared to handle this, because when you talk to the Border Patrol people, they weren't ready for it either. And so we just need to do a better job as America. Hopefully they're opening things in San Antonio and those processes, but those are not easy to do. And unlike local government, the federal government doesn't move as quickly. And so, it's terrible what the kids are doing. They shouldn't be housed like that. But at the same token, requiring them by court order, if you will, to release them in 72 hours doesn't make any sense. You have to do that appropriately. You just can't. You should do some authentication, et cetera, of where they're going and who they're going to go with when they do that. So, last time in 19, we had kids that were being shuffled back and forth by the cartels just to get the adults across the border. And we need to make sure take better care of those kids when they're coming here, and then address the underlying issue of why they're here.
Axios is reporting this morning, I guess, and last night, that the Biden administration is projecting the number of unaccompanied children crossing the border to spiral from more than 16,000 this month to as many as 26,000 in September, according to some documents that they got a hold of. And the Washington Post is talking about DHS, Department of Homeland Security, saying they expect 500,000 to 800,000 migrants in family groups this year. Are we ready for that? And what are we doing about that? And both in terms of a practical consideration of, what do you do with all of these people while they're here? How are they treated? How are we prepared for that? And also, how does this impel policy? Mayor, let me start with you, and then we'll go to the Congresswoman on that.
Well, our focus, McAllen, is right now for family members that are being released, and most have sponsors, if you will, or relatives that they're being released to. So we're handling, we could do, a couple of thousand a day, I guess, and handle them through the process. If it wasn't for COVID, it'd be relatively easy to do. It's a transportation issue for us, getting them on buses to go up north is one of our major problems of why people have to stay overnight, for instance. And so, but we're ready we deal with the bus companies, and we work, the problem is they go full up north, they come in almost empty south because of the populations going north. The customers. So we're dealing with that. I might mention one other thing. Whatever happens, I always say, when the border to the United States happens in Mexico, as we're releasing people back in Mexico, the mayor of Reynosa has to deal with that on her side, because they don't have transportation back to Central America. And like in 19, she was under siege with people sleeping in squares and doorways, and how do you feed them? And they got enough problems of their own there without taking that on. And so it becomes an international problem of what you do, and just thinking it's easy, just turn them back and they're going to go to their country. They don't have transportation back there. And so it is a crisis on the border from a standpoint of we don't set the policies, but we get the brunt of the policies.
Congresswoman, what do you think about that? What are the conditions inside these places? How are we going to house or hold this number of people, if these projections are right?
So the conditions inside the facilities from the time that I visited in 2019 to today are better. The 72 hours for kids is they should not be detained in a Border Patrol facility for 72 hours. The purpose of that is to have that law is because these are vulnerable children, and that's no place for kids. And they need to be in an HHS licensed shelter where there are child welfare specialists, mental health care, medical care, et cetera. Inside these facilities, in 2019, Congress passed a supplemental bill to provide these Border Patrol facilities with fresh clothes for the kids, with toiletries, with hot food. If you'll recall in 2019, the stories of families and children, Border Patrol agents running to a 7-Eleven to buy burritos that they'd warm up for them in the itty bitty microwaves that they had, in their break rooms. And that was inadequate. And so when I had a bipartisan congressional delegation visit to El Paso this weekend, and I was showing my colleagues where our investments had gone. This is still not acceptable, but because kids should not be in Border Patrol custody for very long. But at the very least, they now have clean clothes, they have showers, they have toiletries, hot food. So it is far more humane than what we saw 2 years ago. And again, that's the result of our 2019 supplemental bill. But here's what we really do have to acknowledge. As we again take a step back and look at the numbers of Central American families fleeing has steadily gone up. Over the last 2 years, especially, the strategy by the Trump administration has been to push them out and to basically tell the American public, if they're out of sight and out of mind, it's no longer our problem. That did not mean that they stopped arriving. They just became, as the mayor mentioned, somebody else's quote unquote problem. And the more that the administration, not just the Trump administration, but administrations before him as well, as they limited legal pathways, well, what that does is it puts pressure on the more dangerous, treacherous pathways. It doesn't mean people stop because you're not addressing root causes and you're not looking for reasonable legal pathways. So as an example, one of the things that the Trump administration did was eliminate the Central American Minors Program, which was begun under President Obama. It had not been allowed to really take root and to really bear fruit. But it was a legal pathway for kids who have families in the United States of America, a pathway for them to apply for refugee status. Between 45 and 47% of the kids that are in custody, they have a parent in the United States. They could have utilized that legal pathway. So I think as we continue to see numbers grow, because this is not going to be an issue that goes away, this is not a challenge that goes away, we've got to be able to do several things effectively. Number one, we've got to expand shelter space for kids. The Biden administration is doing that, and it's just a safe, more humane way, a temporary spot until they get to their parents or their close family members. Number two, we've got to re-envision the way that we deal with the situation at the border. And we've got to do it with humanity, and we've got to do it with compassion. And we've got to separate out those who are arriving for humanitarian purposes versus those who are trying to do us harm. And it is possible to do that. The long term is going to take years, and that is addressing the root cause. None of this is going to be easy, Ross. None of this is going to be quick, but we are living the consequences of failures, years of failures to adequately address this. It's now fallen on our lap. It's on our watch, and we've got to manage expectations of the public, but also do everything possible at a number of levels to address this.
It's not really fair for me to ask you to do this briefly, but could you briefly tell me what the root causes are as you see them? I mean, is this cartels that are manipulating a system? Is this people who are running from situations that are so bad that they'll endure all the other stuff? What exactly is going on here?
And it varies from country to country in the Northern Triangle. So not every country's push factors are identical, but very generally speaking, it's poverty. It's the climate catastrophe. You know, the number of Central Americans, indigenous Central Americans who speak dialects that are completely unknown to us is growing because they're being pushed from land that they farmed for generations because of drought, because of hurricanes, a number of calamities related to the climate crisis, you know, that we punted for decades on. Also, you know, I will tell you, I do believe that many of these trafficking organizations have operated with impunity, with direct, I think governments there have known who they are, what they're doing, and have turned a blind eye. Those have to be addressed. We are also now seeing an increase in Mexican asylum seekers because of violence in Mexico and because of economic instability there. The challenges, Ross, are getting more complex. And they're getting bigger. And you know, I recently wrote a piece for the New York Times about what I think should be done. And I think that the administration needs to call a hemispheric summit. We all share an obligation in this hemisphere and a responsibility to do this together. I mean, Mayor Darling did it on a local scale where he brought partners together to find solutions. You know, the White House and federal leaders really could take its cues from, you know, what Mayor Darling did in the past. And I think we have to do it on a larger scale.
Mayor, what would you add to that?
I mean, what we said, it's our hemisphere. You know, that's really what we need to look at. It is our hemisphere. We ought to take care of it and spending billions and billions of dollars in countries that are not going to affect us like this. And so, you know, I agree there's an underlying problem that needs to be dealt with in Central America. And, you know, that they haven't had a great track record with their governments in being non-corrupt. You know, and that's an issue, an excuse, if you will, of why should we do that? Because there's corrupt governments. But we were talking about a workers program to help economically over in those countries. If instead of sending your family, maybe you send the father or the adult brother over here to work. We got tons of job openings that we can't fill with Americans don't want to do them in the construction industry, in the farming industry. And it's worked in Mexico to a certain degree. I mean, I think the Congresswoman is right. I don't think the Mexicans are necessarily coming to work because of economic reasons. It's the violence in Mexico that's sending them. And a lot of that has to do with you have people from Mexico work here and send their money home, and that just stabilizes their economies too. And we ought to take a look at that. We certainly have the need for a workforce to do that. But sitting and not doing nothing and going back to Washington and pointing fingers hasn't been a solution that's worked. Let me put it that way. You know, and we just had the Republican delegation down here, and it's running, not a joke, but it's really too bad that the Republicans go out on the river boats and they look at all the armament and all that. The Democrats go to the centers where the kids are. They have their press conferences and go back to Washington and don't talk to each other. And, you know, we see that, and it doesn't get reported on the national news unless what station you have. But it really is sad that this is a problem you should solve. I think a Congressman was a local government person. We'd already had this solved if it was a local government decision.
We've just got a couple of minutes, so this is probably my last question, but I'm curious from each of you, what's working in the short term, what's working right now? And you know, is it a bunch of DPS money down there? Is it congressional attention? Is it what's actually working on the ground, and what do you need most? And I'll start with you, Mayor, and then go to you, Congresswoman.
Well, you know, I always said they needed social workers, not DPS, you know, and to a certain, and we have a lot of DPS officers. If you ride around near Chimney Park and all that, I mean, I feel sorry for them because they're sitting out there and there's just not that much to do from the standpoint of they don't have jurisdiction. And if you really want to do, at least maybe split it half the DPS and half the social workers, because so the social work could get done by the people who know how to do it and send the Border Patrol back out to protect the border like they want to do and they're paid and trained to do. It's just ridiculous. If you talk to the average Border Patrol person, they're miserable. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. And, you know, and they're not trained to take care of kids. They're not social workers. So I always thought that if you really want to relieve them, that's what we should be doing to help them alleviate what they're doing and go back to protecting the border like they should. It'd be the first thing. And, you know, I appreciate, you know, we have a great partnership in Catholic Charities. And so we're holding our own with that, with the NGOs, and which we expect to get reimbursed because we're really doing an extension of this whole process, if you will. we're testing for COVID. We're now isolating people. It should be a government responsibility, but we're doing it. We're happy to do it because we think it's a responsibility, but we ought to get reimbursed. And the first time we were supposed to get reimbursed under FEMA from the federal government, the governor blocked it because he said it wasn't a national disaster. And I said, okay. So this time we met with DHS. They said, we're going to reimburse you through FEMA. And I said, we better go talk to the governor's office. And the governor said, we're not going to reimburse you through FEMA because we think that it just encourages more of this kind of people coming over seeking asylum. And so, working through another network there. But in fairness to my taxpayers and the NGOs are spending their monies, really we ought to be reimbursed for effort. We're not asking it. We're going to do it anyways, but it would seem to me the right thing to do.
Congresswoman, it looks like he's sending you back to appropriations. What's your take on in the short term, what's working now and what's needed now?
The mayor describes a situation that is similar to what El Paso is experiencing. FEMA stands ready to reimburse 100% all of those costs, and standing in the way is Greg Abbott. And so we are having to think about creative workarounds to help local governments and local organizations, because we have a governor who prefers to put people at risk and keep people in peril and squeeze the local taxpayer than to just open the door to FEMA's help. It's really reprehensible what's happening. But here's what's working. What's working is we've got folks in communities like Mayor Darling and the NGOs there, the NGOs and the leadership here in El Paso as well, that have gotten sort of used to responding in a humanitarian and goodwill way. So we have that. That's wonderful. We have a president and an administration and a Secretary Mayorkas, wanting to do everything possible to move quickly to stand up influx facilities, to move these kids into better temporary conditions while they expedite getting them into the arms of their family members. Because as you know, the vast majority of everybody else is still being expelled under Title 42. I think the Title 42 is unsustainable for Mexico. And at some point you're going to see Mexico saying, yeah, we're done. We can't continue to hide your problem in our communities or handle them here. So we have to be ready for that. We have to be ready for what that means. And we have to be ready for what will be, I think, over the next few years, a challenge that continues to create instability until we have hemispheric stability, and until we have some major reform at the border in terms of DHS reform, HHS reform, ORR reform, all the agencies involved. I've invited Secretary Mayorkas to visit so that we could talk through some of what Mayor Darling has mentioned, which is, as we rethink the way that we handle these situations, we need more human services personnel. We need more social workers. We need more mental health providers. All of those are important positions that need to populate agencies that are at the border, instead of approaching it only as a law enforcement function. So my hope is that with the new secretary, who is really a very thoughtful, smart, wonderful human being, that he will work very closely with us to create that change. And I feel very hopeful also about the long term with Vice President Harris.
And with that, we are out of time. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you to Congresswoman Veronica Escobar and Mayor Jim Darling for joining us. For more coverage from the Texas Tribune, visit texastribune.org and get the latest on immigration and border news with our weekly newsletter at trib.it/immigration. Thanks, everyone.